On this day, the 12th of November, 1991, the Dilli Massacre took place in East Timor. So on this day, 250 East Timorese were shot and killed by the Indonesian military. This was at a funeral of a East Timorese who was for independence, a part of a group that had resisted Indonesian occupation for many years. East Timor is now independent. It has been independent since 2002. In 1999, they had a referendum after many years of pressure and embarrassment because of this massacre, and in that referendum, they voted overwhelmingly for independence. Indonesia relinquished control of East Timor and handed over the country to the UN, which occupied it for 3 years until independence was achieved. But in 1975, with the collapse of the military regime, or the Novo Order regime in Portugal, Portugal was very eager to relinquish all of its colonies. They became independent very quickly. Angola, Mozambique, Equatorial Guinea, or Portuguese Guinea, I think that was called, Cape Verde. So all of these places became independent very quickly. They even offered Macau to China, which refused and wanted to wait and see what happened with Hong Kong. But East Timor was somewhere else they wanted to offload very quickly. Unfortunately, the people who were going to take over were a little bit on the left wing, so Indonesia didn't really want that right next door to them. Indonesia at this time being ruled by Suharto, who had, when he took over, killed approximately 500,000 people to gain control and to put down the communists within Indonesia. Just so happens that most of those communists were ethnic Chinese, so it took on an air of a pogrom. But he didn't want a left-leaning republic that might go towards the Soviet Union next door to him. There are some people who say he was encouraged by the United States. Perhaps it wouldn't be the first time that happened. However, in 1975, the Indonesian army, after 9 days of independence, marched in to East Timor. They put down resistance, and later that year annexed it as the 27th province of Indonesia. They would rule it until 1999, but the protests against Indonesia never really went away. Violence would flare up, protests would come and go, small massacres and extrajudicial killings would happen, people were imprisoned and exiled from the island to other parts of Indonesia. But for most of the world, it didn't really matter. East Timor is a small little country, tiny, it's irrelevant. It's part of Indonesia, no one really cared. And so for many years, for the 80s and half of the 70s, people were quite happy with it being a part of Indonesia. Especially Australia. They wanted to do business with Indonesia. And so the government in Australia were apologists for the occupation of East Timor. East Timorese would regularly remind the Australians that during the Japanese invasion of Indonesia, East Timorese helped the Australians fight the Japanese. And Portugal being neutral, they were able to get Australians out through East Timor, back to Australia. But again, small groups of people knew this, small groups of people sympathised. But this all started to change in 1991. There had been allegations of torture, there had been allegations of human rights abuses, and so the United Nations was going to send a rapporteur to go there, have a look, see what was going on, see if they could do a report on the situation in East Timor. Originally, a delegation from the Portuguese Parliament was set to attend as well, along with some Western reporters. Indonesia objected to this. They said some of these reporters were anti-Indonesian, they were Western, trying to undermine the country. At this time, Suharto was still in control, so Indonesia wasn't a democracy as it is now. So Portugal dropped their delegation, and this had a strange effect. People in the pro-independence movement in East Timor were disappointed with this, depressed, and so they started protesting. And at one point, the Indonesian army ended up in a conflict with a group in a church. So there's a shootout. They go into the church and they bring a fella out, Gomez, I think his name is, and they shot him. During the fighting, a pro-Indonesian was also stabbed to death, and so you have a few people dead, so it's a bit dodgy. So the funeral is held a few days later, on the 12th, and there are a few Western journalists there, including Amy Goodman, who is a reporter with Democracy Now! At the moment, quite a left-wing type in America. But she was there, and she was a witness to the events that were going to happen, and even got involved in a way. So they go to the funeral, and there's a couple of thousand people going to the funeral of this pro-independence fellow. And they're coming towards the cemetery. They have big signs and flags, and it's very noisy, but it's not violent at this point. Some people get into clashes with the Indonesian authorities, and more soldiers come down. Eventually, don't know why exactly, but they start shooting into the crowds. So at this funeral in the Santa Cruz cemetery, Amy Goodman, as I said, she started putting herself between East Timorese people and the Indonesian soldiers, trying to prevent them from shooting, because she knew that being a Western journalist, they would probably hold off. One of her colleagues had his head fractured, his skull fractured, because they started beating them rather than shooting them. But during the shooting, in and outside the cemetery, 250 East Timorese were killed. Now, there was also a British cameraman there, and he was able to film this secretly. Afterwards, they smuggled the film out, and with Amy Goodman's testimony and the testimony of other reporters who had been there, and the film, it became a scandal. It was broadcast on British television and then around the world, and it caused outrage. So the pro-Timorese movements suddenly became very popular. People started supporting them, and they started putting pressure on the representatives. So in the United States, Australia, Britain, Portugal, there were large movements supporting East Timorese and for their self-determination. So throughout the 90s, things started getting worse for the Indonesian authorities. They were being seen as baddies, and bit by bit, they were being more and more embarrassed, and throughout the 90s, there were more massacres, there were more reports of shootings and extrajudicial killings, torture, and this was becoming unbearable for the Indonesian authorities. When Suharto had to go, which he finally did after the Asian financial crisis, they got rid of him, and that's when the Indonesians decided we can't be doing this anymore. So that's when the 1999 referendum went ahead, and it was a very clear result. And that's when Indonesia handed East Timor over to the United Nations. So, it may have been a terrible massacre, but it did eventually lead to East Timor's independence. Although whether that is completely good on its own is a matter of opinion. East Timor has, since independence, been a bit of a failed state. It's still miserably poor, badly run, there's still civil war, massacres, and abuses of human rights. It goes on, so it doesn't seem that the end of Indonesian rule has done much good. Hopefully, in the decades ahead, that will change. So on this day, 12th of November 1991, the Santa Cruz Massacre, or the Dilli Massacre, took place, eventually leading to Timorese independence. If you like these videos, come back tomorrow for more. Like, subscribe, and comment.